start.
Thank you, Paul. To get this started, actually, Rick Wilson at CGS, California Geologic Survey, asked me to kind of give some context to get us going today. So this slide is actually a slide of tsunamis that have occurred around the world since 2004. And since that time, 2004 to today, we've lost over 300,000 people worldwide to tsunamis, which most of you in this room know. So it's really raised the awareness and concern about tsunami hazard mitigation, but also what policies we put in place, and that's what I want to focus on, is really what we've learned from the recent tsunamis around disaster management, and then what we're trying to do about that. How do I advance? Do you advance?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the key things when you think about tsunamis relative to other disasters that's really important from a policy perspective is just the nature of tsunamis. I call this kind of the binary nature. What is in harm's way typically is really severely damaged, and within a few meters of that, things can look pretty normal. And that one of the other really particularly challenging issues of tsunami is just the sort of the nature of the swath of devastation. It can be a few meters to kilometers wide, but go thousands of kilometers long, cross oceans, cover many cities and towns. And this presents a lot of different challenges for emergency management, for disaster recovery, and for planning. Next slide, please. So what I want to first talk about are some of those recovery challenges and how that affects policy. This is a picture of Tohoku, Japan, Minami Sanriku, which was devastated by the 2011 tsunami. And I'm going to focus my discussion on recovery challenges using Japan as a case study, but this really does apply to the same lessons that we've been observing in Indonesia and other countries impacted by the 2004 tsunami, and also the Chilean tsunami in particular, which are the ones we've been studying long term. So one of the first issues is just the large-scale displacements and the ripple effects that has across society, which can delay and really potentially undermine recovery. So in many of these communities, like Minami Sanriku, not only have they had devastating human loss, there have been a variety of ripple effects that have affected the local economy, which have now moved across sectors like the fishing industry nationwide. And so it's that rippling effect that really does happen in tsunamis that we don't necessarily see at the same scale or the same interconnectivity in other kinds of disasters. 470,000 people were initially evacuated, and even today the numbers are over 200,000 people who in Japan are still in temporary housing awaiting their reconstruction of their housing. The second issue is just the motivation for risk avoidance really goes up after a tsunami, particularly these devastating tsunamis, but that erodes with time and also as the full costs of doing risk avoidance is realized. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that with Japan as a case study. And the third issue really is that this concentrated devastation requires complex governance arrangements for financing the recovery, for the collaboration needed, especially in places like Japan and Indonesia. Many local government officials actually perished in the tsunami themselves, and so you have local governments without leadership, and you have to bring in leadership from the next level of government or NGOs, et cetera, to help these communities' recovery. So this ends up affecting not only the community recovery, but also the financing. How do you rebuild the infrastructure? How do you restructure the economy in these places? Next slide. So using Japan as a case study, what happened after the tsunami really is that complex governing began quite soon with the national government setting up first a National Reconstruction Design Council that put forward some general concepts and strategies for recovery in the damaged areas. Really with a very strong emphasis on mitigation, but it's sort of while it might seem semantically not a big change in wording, it actually is a really big change in terms of policy approach, moving from the traditional idea of disaster prevention. I went to school at the Disaster Prevention Research Institute at Kyoto University. Prevention has always been a very strong concept in the Japanese disaster management policy arena, but moving more to an area of disaster reduction. And what that really meant was saying for the first time we can't actually engineer our way completely out of this risk, but we will focus our risk on what they call hard measures, such as levee construction, to really deal with the 1% annualized probability type events, and then putting in a series of what we might call multiple lines of defense, with softer measures that would include changes in land use, planning, and a number of things. And I'll show you for the events with the lower probability of risk, like the 2011 tsunami. So I'll show you how that's playing out. Next slide, please. So this is actually a concept drawing that was in that June 25th, 2011 report, talking about the level 1 tsunami management, where you would actually have breakwaters in the ocean, you would have the levees on land, all designed with this 1% annualized probability. And then you would begin to create a series of level 2 measures that include a reordering of land uses so that people and residences are moved to the highest ground possible, and that you would use roads or train tracks, other things as your backup levees. So a series of different technical approaches, as well as softer measures like planning for evacuation, et cetera. Next slide, please. So just show you how this is playing out on the ground. This is Rikuzen Takeda, the next few slides of this. So this is actually taken in 2012, where the sea is behind us and we're looking towards the mountains, and I'll orient you. What you see right here is actually the first roads that are being put back in, and everything is being elevated slightly, and even at this lower level elevation right near the backup levee itself. Next slide. And so this is, that picture is taken somewhere down in the yellow area there next to the port, the harbor. And what you see here in this plan for the city is a reconsolidation of land uses. So the hillside areas, the yellow swaths up there are actually up in the hills where housing is being moved to. And then down in the lower areas, they're actually elevating the land even at sea level, raising that 2 to 4 meters in some cases, and replanting commercial and industrial uses down there. So this is a massive, massive rebuilding effort. Next slide, please. These are just some images taken at the beginning of 2014, where you see what's happening there is a series of conveyances that have been constructed. So as the land is being graded for the hillside relocations, that material is actually moved down and used and compacted down in the flatlands to raise those as well. Next slide, please. So Japan's been going through a very extensive planning and implementation process, and this just is a graph we put together for a paper we did recently talking about how these things have worked through time. And so the phases really represent years almost exactly. And in the first year, they really did a lot of planning. They came up with this concept of level 1 and level 2, what heights they would actually design the level 1 structures to. They did 4 prefectural and 81 local recovery plans. In the second year, they really began to put together the strategies for implementing those plans, what programs they would use. And so there's actually 224 what are called collective relocation projects. So these are like neighborhood scale relocations that are going on across the region, as well as 59 land raising projects, and also a technique of land management they use in Japan called land readjustment. But it just means you bring all the rights together, you consolidate them, and then you split them back out into a new order. And over 20,000 public housing units are being built. The cost for the national government's commitment to this is over 250 billion US over 5 years. And just meeting with officials last week, they're already starting to think about what happens after year 5, because this won't be done, especially for Fukushima Prefecture. So they're going to have to go back and develop more money to implement this process. So this has been a massive project, a massive commitment at the national level. There's also prefectural and local government commitments to match this money. Next slides. So what are some insights from Japan, but also from Chile and Indonesia that we've sort of tried to distill that I think is important from the science perspective that I wanted to share? The first, these are what I would say things we've learned about hazard mitigation post-tsunami. So one is the challenges of restricting land use development in hazardous areas even post-disaster. So while you see that plan being implemented in Ricus and Takeda, there are actually communities in Tohoku who have actually now started to question the planning that they did early on after the disaster, and are actually saying, do we need the levee heights at the heights that we actually initially were proposed? Do we actually really want to relocate our neighborhoods? Do we want to go through this scale of disruption? So it really becomes more difficult over time to do those kinds of large-scale projects. So we always talk about land use planning being something hard to do pre-disaster. It's hard to do post-disaster. Second issue is that the hazard and design parameters need to really reflect the uncertainty of the risk. There's no greater example of this than what we know about Japan not having accounted for a magnitude 9 in that area, generating that scale of tsunami in their national seismic hazard mapping, and thus it wasn't in the tsunami derivative products. So I think it's important for us to realize that when we miss things like that, particularly with tsunami, the near field sources, these errors can be deadly. Another issue is really who does mapping for tsunamis. And what we've seen is that the standardized mapping and mapping methodologies can inflict bias, they can inflict correlated uncertainties like I just described, but they also do stimulate local application and adoption. So rather than leaving it up to local governments to develop their own plans, their own maps, I think the approaches that we've taken in California to do standardized maps for different communities at the state level, I think it does really promote adoption based on observations we've seen elsewhere. And the last issue is there's considerable value in the regulations and funding for tsunami hazard modeling, mapping, and mitigation, which we probably all in this room know, but some people may not. Next slide, please. So now thinking about how you translate what we've been observing around the world into a pre-disaster policy context, I just show here that this is something taken from the USGS, showing the tsunamis we've had in the U.S. It's primarily a West Coast Pacific Rim threat, but the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, is also vulnerable. And this actually in the top right is work that was done for a USGS scenario project that we did that maybe some others on the panel will talk about. It's called SAFRR, but it was looking at an Aleutian Islands event, magnitude 9 type event impacting the California coast. And so I'll just share it with you. Next slide, please. So the main point was that the main sources affecting California, and that was a source model, are from Alaska. So these are the two policy documents that we've been working on in California. The first is this USGS SAFRR scenario that was issued in 2013, and then, and then this past March in 2014, we had an ad hoc working group in California that issued its policy recommendations. So I'll just walk you through these real quick. Next slide, please. I know. For the SAFRR scenario, we actually looked at the current disaster management system in the U.S., looked at identifying some overarching policy considerations, and then setting forward some priority public policy issues organized around the different recovery function or disaster management functions, response, recovery, and risk awareness. And next slide, please. Some of the overarching policy considerations really is just a main point I want to make is that tsunami hazards really do not have the same policy framework as well structured as other perils in the U.S., such as flooding or earthquake shaking related hazards or hurricanes. Another major policy consideration is that something like the SAFRR scenario impacting the California coast could be adequately managed within our existing policy framework, but the fact that it would be a multi-state effort would probably really create a lot of challenges for those coastal communities and for the states that would have to deal with this hazard or this event, which would put it on the scale of something like Hurricane Sandy or Hurricane Katrina in terms of this multi-state mobilization. Next slide. The other is just that there are significant gaps in tsunami risk awareness that within the public as well as specific sectors, and I think some on the panel are going to talk about one in particular, which is the maritime community, and that creates some real gaps for recovery, which can really undermine these communities' abilities to respond and recover. Next slide. In terms of the ad hoc working group, what we did was go more specific with very detailed recommendations. There are 47 of those. Next slide, please. They are organized into 3 areas: building a solid foundation for mitigation, which is really about trying to make sure that we find more ways to incentivize communities to opt into the NOAA Tsunami Ready program, reauthorizing the Federal Tsunami Warning and Education Act. This is something that we need for funding. The second set of issues is around practicing risk-based land use and construction. And I have 5 seconds. Next slide, please. And within that, we want to use the State Seismic Hazard Map Act to include tsunamis, and then enhancing emergency management. Thank you. Let's see. I think there's one more slide, but it just says thank you.